Welcome to episode 60 of the Life at Mission podcast. My name is Kay Helm, and today my guest is Chris Staron, host of the Truce Podcast. Chris is an exceptional storyteller, and we're going to talk about why he does what he does and how he does what he does. My guest today is Chris Staron, an award-winning filmmaker, author, comedian, and podcaster. His heart is for people who are on the outside edges of popular Christianity. Hi, Chris. How you doing?
All right, Kay, yourself?
Wonderful. It's a nice sunny day here in Virginia.
Well, it's a nice clear day here in Wyoming.
Well, to get started, we would love to hear a little about you. I know that obviously you're a storyteller, but tell us a little more.
Yeah, so I'm an identical twin, so you'll sometimes hear me refer to myself as we, because my brother and I end up doing things all the time, and I just lump it all together because I'm always with him.
That's cool.
Really great guy. And so I wrote and directed and produced 2 feature-length films, 2 DVDs of shorts, one of which was animated, one of which was live action. I wrote Christian novels, and I'm doing this podcast called Truce, which is a history show about how the Christian church has interacted with the world and how history impacts us and how we impact history. So I'm just wrapping up a series about how the rise of communism in Russia impacted the American Christian church, which sounds like a snooze fest, but actually is really fascinating when you get into it, all the ways that modern Christianity in the United States has come out of our fear of communism. And when I'm not doing that, I also have to self-fund all of those things. Mm-hmm. So I almost have always had a second job. And so now I am a school bus driver as well to help finance the podcast.
It's obviously a passion of yours.
I don't think I could stop if I wanted to as far as Truce, because every time I think I'm done with a story, there's like 4 other stories behind that. Like it inspires 4 more stories. And so I just keep going and going and going.
Oh man. Yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah, and even I had scheduled out how I was going to end season 3, which is about communism, and I now have over a year's worth of topics coming up already listed out. So it's like, yep, I guess I'm going to keep doing this for a while.
Wow.
Yeah.
So storytelling is obviously a big part of who you are.
It is. Yeah. Well, I find that it helps me understand how we work as people, which is really important if you have a sort of missions heart and your desire to see people grow in the Lord. But it's also important if you want to understand this kind of wacky time that we're in right now, how we got to where we are and how we can do better. And it helps if you can understand why we are the way we are and those steps that came in. So I found myself a lot I was teaching high school boys Sunday school. I was involved in adult ministries and stuff, constantly explaining things to folks, and they're like, yeah, nobody's ever told me about the curse of Ham or something like that. And I'm like, what? How am I the only person who knows about this? And I'm a medium intelligence, but I can be a real dum-dum about a lot of stuff. And so it's been a joy for me to learn these things and then come back and teach them. And it was like, oh, I guess maybe I should do a podcast taking those stories and trying to tell them to people.
Wow. And those stories, even those stories, like you said, that we don't really think about a lot. You gave the example of the curse of Ham.
Yeah.
So a little story about when we first started the nonprofit that I'm a part of. And so this would be 2006. And I became the leader of this organization that was taking care of education for some kids in Uganda. And Sarah, the woman in charge of that program there, she said, I have one question for you. And this was her question to see if she wanted to work with me. And she said, what do you believe about the curse of Ham?
Yeah. And hopefully you said it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And God is good. He had prepared me for this. He had actually really drawn me into that whole story, and I had studied it. And that's exactly what my response was. It does not exist. Ham was never cursed. In fact, he was blessed.
Canaan's the one curse. Yeah.
But that was going to impact everything that we did. What she was really asking is, do you believe that we are cursed?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when somebody has to ask you that, it's really a wake-up moment.
It is. It's sad. But for those listening who don't know what the curse of Ham is, when Noah goes through the whole flood, and the flood recedes, and they go on to dry land. He has 3 sons, one of which is named Ham. And there's that whole weird story that everybody skips over in the Bible about him being covered up with his nakedness and then placing a curse. And everybody's like, we'll just skip that. We don't know what that's about. It's actually a very important story, not just in the Bible, but also in real life. So Noah gets up and he curses somebody and says, your people will be the servants of your brothers. And so then those sons of Noah go in different directions. And Ham is not cursed. I think it's his son, Canaan. Is cursed. And so Canaan ends up being cursed, which is why later in the Bible, the Canaanites are the ones who are killed when the people of Israel come back into Israel.
Right.
And everybody's like, well, why did that happen? It's because of the curse of Canaan. But what got turned into was people pretended, because it's not in the text, it's not there in the text that Ham was cursed, but people pretended that Ham was cursed. And therefore Ham went down to Africa, and his people became Africans who would then, quote unquote, as the theory would go, would then become the servants of all people. And so it was a justification for slavery, especially in the United States, was this story that was quote unquote biblical, but is actually not in the Bible and goes a completely different direction if you read the text. So I ended up doing several stories about this on Truce. And every time I thought I was done, it would come back. I'm like, okay, fine, we'll talk about the curse of Ham again. But it's one of those little weird stories in the Bible that has a tremendous amount of impact, and it apparently is still felt today.
Yeah, it has so many repercussions when that one little twist of God's word.
And I think it really demonstrates a lot. And one of my desires in life is always to say, read the Bible, and read it for yourself. And it's great to get good teaching and stuff, but always read before the story, read after the story. Actually, read the whole thing, read the whole Bible, because there's all sorts of stuff like this that we get taught in popular Christianity that is just not there. It's a real shame that something that is so easily disproven comes up time and time and time again.
Yeah, and it drives just some really abhorrent behavior.
It really does.
It's done a lot of harm, and that's what happens, right? I mean, it was that original lie in the garden when the snake asked that question and Eve twisted what God had said just a little bit off.
Did God really say this thing? Yeah.
No.
Or you find Satan in the New Testament talking to Jesus when he's being tempted, using scripture out of context to try to back his positions. It happens. It really does. So, and it's one of those things I found myself actually telling the curse of Ham over and over again before I started the podcast. And it's like, okay, fine. I guess I need to talk about this on the show.
Yeah.
Because there's so much freedom in getting around those things and understanding what's going on and where our little hangups come from. And if you can understand the history behind it, you can make a much more informed decision. And I think be much better equipped in your ministry.
So true. That's so true. And when we have these things that we've kind of just heard and absorbed all our lives, there's doctrine, but then there's culture. And culture is really what affects our behavior. And we call it doctrine sometimes. We will say we justify our culture by our doctrine when it's actually not. Or it may even be contrary to the actual doctrine, but we won't examine it close enough.
Yeah. Well, and if you want proof of that, just go into the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is saying, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And how many of us in the church, we hear our pastors actually not saying turn the other cheek, but get what's yours. And it's all over Christian media and culture that you're supposed to thrive and all that kind of stuff. But when Jesus is constantly saying, no, give your brother your cloak, give your stuff away. Yeah. If you want a subversive message, just read the Bible for yourself. Read the books about Jesus and probably be surprised.
Yes. Yeah, sticking with what he actually says and does is, I think, the best policy, but not always the easiest way, for sure.
No, of course not. I mean, especially turn the other cheek. We Anytime I'm wronged, I get really angry. And, I drive a school bus. I am constantly in traffic with, people doing ridiculous things because nobody wants to be behind a school bus.
Right.
And the things that people do to get around a school bus, unbelievable. So it's been a constant challenge for me just to try to love people from the bus.
Wow. Love People from the Bus. That sounds like a great book.
Does it? Yeah. I've got too many things to do.
Oh, there's something else to do now. Oh, no. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
Well, on this show, on this podcast, we say, find your voice, tell your story, change the world. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on is that in your podcast, we've talked a little bit about the subject matter. And I do want to come back to talking about expectations kind of in Christian media. There's almost a formulaic thing that we expect, and which you don't really do. And that's one of the reasons that I love your show.
Oh, praise God.
But the other reason is that your podcast is really more produced than the average podcast. I mean, my show, I have a guest on, we just have a conversation and I record it. And so that's a really simple production process.
Still a lot of work.
It is, but not nearly what you do. And so if you've never heard the Truce podcast, what Chris does is he crafts these stories. I mean, you do research. And then you might have other people come do voiceovers and play parts as you kind of recreate some things. I've heard you use recordings of actual historical things.
Yeah.
You bring all that in, sound effects and some music. I mean, it's really highly produced and done with excellence too. And you could just sit down and riff on these topics.
Right.
You could do research and just sit down and talk about it. But how did you make that decision to produce Truce the way that you do?
Yeah, well, I have done some episodes that are just interviews, and I'm totally fine with that when it's appropriate. Part of the hard thing in the market that we're in is that we're not used to getting context. It's usually, this is good, this is bad, follow what's good, don't do this. But you don't often find context in the Christian media or in media in general. And so part of that is like, I don't want to put people to sleep. If I'm talking about the Ad Council, which is actually a profoundly important organization in the United States and in the world, but none of us know who they are except, they created Smokey Bear or McGruff the Crime Dog. But the goal is always to be like, I need you to be interested long enough that you understand why this thing is important. And so as part of a storyteller, the goal is always to find a way to make it interesting. I think it was Albert Einstein, I may be misquoting this completely, but said that basically any average person can understand pretty much anything as long as they have a good teacher. I really do believe that's true, that most any topic can be explained to a person of average intelligence if they just have somebody who's willing to explain it to them well. And so my goal is always to take this information and a story that generally I think is very exciting and make it interesting to other people. Like I even did a little bit about the importance of shipping containers.
Yeah, I did.
And
I read that one.
Yeah. And we don't think of them as being really important, but they're super important. And they play this huge role in history and in the way that our economics work in this country. So I had to devise a way to make people get interested in shipping containers.
Wow.
Yeah.
The thoughts that run through my head when I'm listening to the Truce podcast are things like, wow, I never thought of that, or I never saw it that way. Those are constant. That's my response all the time.
Yeah. That's the hope. And it's a tough way to go in the Christian market, especially. I find that people search for topics that they're interested in. They don't really want to be surprised by, oh, wow, this is really interesting. We're just not used to that. And so that's one of the battles I've been facing as I title an episode, The Ad Council, the CIA, and Christian America. It's like, well, people may not want to listen to that. It might not be interesting. Or The American Coup in Guatemala, a very important episode and one of my favorites, but it's hard to get people interested in if that's not what they're already looking for. But the shows that I love the most are the ones that you walk away like, oh, I had no idea that the shipping container was so important, or that 10 Commandments monuments haven't been around forever. I'd like a sense of wonder. I just think it's such a vital way to learn. You continue to learn. You got your master's and stuff. you know how important it is as an adult to continue to learn things. And wonder is a great way to do that, to keep people focused learning.
Yeah, that's good. Like we say, storytelling, it's that you have developed these skills of storytelling. You're going through a lot of work to produce something to hold our interest.
Yeah.
What's the process for you to produce a typical episode?
Yeah. Well, I generally come up with the idea months and months and months in advance. So I've just got lists of ideas, and I try to order them in a spreadsheet. So I get kind of an idea of a logical progression of this leads to that, that leads to that, that leads to that, which can be confusing for the audience because they'll see me covering things like the New Deal, and they'll be like, why in the world would you talk about the New Deal? Well, in 3 or 4 episodes, it's going to like start featuring in every single thing we talk about. So you really need to understand what it is. Or why did we talk about Russia for like 6 episodes? It's because I don't want you to just judge those people and be like, those ridiculous Russians fell into communism. And there's no logic to how they got there. It's faulty logic, but there is logic. And so it helps us have compassion to see like, oh, this is how they got there. These are the circumstances and things. So I'm always kind of looking for a progression in stories so that they try to build on each other. And so once I've got that, I just start reading books and listening to podcasts and watching documentaries, get some ideas. And oftentimes it's too much to give people a lot of things to walk away with. So I'm trying to generally start the episode with the takeaway. Then I work through the story, and about halfway through, you re-encounter the thing we talked at the beginning that you thought had nothing to do with the show at the topic at all.
Yeah.
That comes back up. And then I kind of end with that same takeaway idea so that you're encountering that a few different times. And a lot of times I'm interviewing experts in the field who may not even be Christians. And that to me is really fascinating and has been exciting. It does impact the download numbers because a lot of people go like, oh, my favorite Christian celebrity is on this podcast. I'm going to go listen to it. You don't get that on my show very often.
Right.
It's usually, it's this random professor from this university that I've never heard of, or, this author of this book. But I'm trying to find actual experts on stuff rather than somebody who can just yak about things.
Right.
And so I find that makes it for a much better show. And so oftentimes what I'll do is I'll go through their interview, if it's an interview episode, and I will break it up into chunks, and I'll kind of write my script as I go. And in Hindenburg, which is what I edit in, you can name your chunks and put them in little bins side of the screen. And so I organize, as I'm writing the script, I'll put in brackets the name of the chunk that goes here, and then I'll write my script and then the name of the chunk that goes there. And so I kind of try to get a layout like that. And I can, switch things around. I work through the script maybe 3 times as I'm going through, because it's much easier to fix it when it's a script than when it's recorded.
It's true.
And yeah. And then I go and I record my part. And what I'm trying to do is my voice is kind of naturally high pitch, but I'm trying to lower it a little bit because I've been getting higher and higher as the season's gone on. So my brother's been coaching me to bring it down. And I record those bits, and then I just go through and I edit it as I go, and I add music and sound effects and things. Generally, like the little reenactments and things are planned, but there are times when I'm editing where I'm like, I really could use somebody else's voice here, or, I really should rewrite this thing. So it generally takes between 20 and 40 hours an episode. And again, I'm doing this on the side. I have a full-time job. Though I'm a school bus driver, I do take a lot of out-of-town trips and things. So I generally tend to get a lot of hours just driving the bus. So it takes a long, long time and a lot of commitment to do this show. Oftentimes I'm working from 6:30 in the morning until like 6 or 6:30 at night between the 2 jobs, sometimes 6 days a week. So it's a lot. It's an awful lot of things to do, but I enjoy the process a lot. And I sometimes mess up. There was an episode I released over Thanksgiving that I released 2 weeks early. And I had to write the audience like, I'm sorry, I've got nothing to put in its place in 2 weeks. Let's just pretend this is coming out when it's supposed to.
There you go.
Just because, it's funny because even a simple podcast has a lot of back end stuff that nobody knows about.
That's right.
Writing the show notes and uploading it and making graphics and those kinds of things, building your website. And so all that other stuff goes in and I make mistakes, but it gives me a lot of hope. I'm so excited for the day that, God willing, I can have a staff. That would be so great to be able to say, you go research this thing. That would be the greatest, but I'm kind of a long ways away from that right now.
I, for one, will be cheering you on, because when I think of Truce, I mean, so if you haven't heard Truce, and I know I've tried to describe it, but if you have heard like an NPR podcast, you know, and the way they produce things, BBC kind of does the same. I mean, there's so, like, they have a whole newsroom doing that. So you're doing that solo.
Right. Yeah. And so they're going to, that's why the show comes out only every 2 weeks. And there are some times where I have to have an interview with somebody. I just had an interview with Sky Jitani that I came out, and I have a few coming up to try to buy really myself time. Yeah. The nice thing about him is you just let him go. Like, I didn't have to be brilliant. He just kind of went, and it was great. So it was actually kind of easy, but I do kind of buffer sometimes when I need to buy time, and I'll have to replay some episodes coming up as well to buy myself some time, because it does take a tremendous amount of time for me to make these episodes. It's hard for me not to do a story in this manner, because the shows I love to listen to are generally told in this sort of public radio style. And I find them to be really engaging. And it's something that not many people are doing in the Christian market. So there's kind of this great opportunity to fill that need.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you just mentioned the Christian market. And before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about, there are all these expectations. There's kind of, when you say Christian radio, Christian movie, Christian TV, right? There's a particular type of program that comes to mind.
Yeah, for each of those. Yeah. And they're all kind of run by different folks. And the tough thing, I did some episodes on this in season 2 on the Christian film market and why it is the way it is. And once you kind of understand the back end, the front end makes total sense. Mm-hmm. For the Christian film world specifically, what's interesting about it is that it is very underfunded, and it has been underfunded basically for all of its existence, even though some of them, the very first films ever made at all, moving pictures, were Christian films, going back to the Lumiere brothers, but they've always been underfunded. So part of the problem is, how do I make money on this underfunded thing? And movies, unlike podcasts, a movie is incredibly expensive, no matter what level you make it at. You can't make a cheap film that looks good and or sounds good. So how do you pay that back? And the trouble is that in the Christian market, especially now in the world of streaming, it's really, really hard to make money, because like Amazon Prime, which my films are on, we get 6 cents per hour watched. So if somebody watches my films all the way through, I get 9 cents, which is terrible. You can't do anything with that. Do the math and figure out how many views it would take me to make a 1-day living wage. And also remember, I have to split that across me and my brother. It would be an insane number. It would, like, every single person in my state would have to watch the film for me.
Well, all right, people, get on it.
Well, yeah, or just send me 10 cents. So you got that issue, especially now. But in the DVD world, back when Hollywood Video or Blockbuster were going, I think it was Hollywood Video paid you per download or per viewing. When somebody would take the DVD out of the store, you got basically $1. It was a little less than that, but we'll just say it was $1. And so here we are 20 years later, and we're getting 9 cents, despite all the inflation and the growth. So the market is changing to, where are the people who are actually paying money? Because the streaming, we can't make the money on streaming. So the money is made in theater rentals, and it was before, but now it is becoming more important. Well, it was before COVID. Yeah. But the problem with theater rentals is you need a film that will grab people and get them in the seats. So I can't remember the one. It was about Abby Johnson and Unplanned. That one was about a pro-life movie that came out like 2 or 3 years ago. That one got butts in the seats because it was a pro-life film and it wasn't going to get mainstream stuff. And Fox News was pushing it pretty hard as well. It still did really poorly compared to a normal film, like a Hollywood film. But that kind of sensationalism got it out there because it was controversial. They could get the butts in the seats and they could pay for the thing. If you get a film that's just a nice romantic comedy or something, it's much harder to market. So there is there's a temptation to build something that is going to make people angry so that they will show up. Or the other thing is you're seeing a lot more building on existing properties. So they'll take an existing book or a movie or song even, and they'll make a whole movie based on that existing property. So, so that person's existing audience will come in and support it. And that sounds like it's really benign, but it actually is, to a creative market, it is kind of a death knell, because if you're being incentivized to only tell stories based on a true story, you're seeing the end of creative stories, original thought. And so, yeah, I can go on and on about that, but like the Christian book world is a very similar way. It operates off of who is buying stuff, and the people who buy books are generally people who want to be angry, or you're looking at very conservative people or very charismatic people. Those are your markets. And if you're not angry, charismatic, or conservative, and exactly like they want, the people aren't buying the book, so you won't find a publisher. And that's just sort of the realities of the market. If we wanted to change things as consumers, we would support the people who are making different materials. But those people are often lower budget, because they don't have the big publishing houses and things behind them.
Yeah. So there's, at the same time all of that's happening, we got self-publishing is exploding, but then that's kind of like, you never really know what you're going to get.
No, you don't. Yeah. And yeah, there's a beauty of the gatekeepers is they kind of thinned the herd a little bit. Now anybody can get out there, but also as an author, having done this myself, part of the problem is that I not only have to be a good writer, and I'm okay, I also have to be a really good graphic designer for the cover, and I have to be a really great proofreader, because I've got nobody overseeing there's no editorial staff looking at this thing and making it a better book. So hard to proof
your own stuff too.
It is, yeah. And then you also have to be amazing at marketing your book, which, you can't be amazing at all of those things. It was kind of the same in the Christian film world. It's like I could be a pretty good writer-director, but I'm a terrible marketer. Because I feel like marketing is sleazy. I just don't like doing it. And I shouldn't say all marketers are sleazy. That's not what I meant to say, but I feel sleazy doing it. But we as like independent creators are called on to be all those things, and we're not going to be able to be all of them well.
Yeah, you can't wear all the hats. You don't. No, you've got that one thing. If we could work in our gifts and bring the people around, and of course, bringing people around to be a part of your project often requires a budget.
It does, yeah, because we got to eat.
Exactly.
People have contacted me about being a part of their shows, but I can't take on yet another. I have 3 jobs right now. I can't take on another one. So yeah. We talk a little bit about the expectations of the Christian market and the content that you explore on Truce, and the way that you give context to things that we don't always think all the way through that really affect our Christian culture. And then you're talking about the gatekeepers and all these different influences that affect who we're hearing. And you touched on something I want to go back to, where you said you have to be angry to get your book published or your piece out there. When I first started working in the nonprofit world, I had subscribed to a magazine. I don't know if anybody remembers print magazines, but magazine on fundraising, and there's this one issue of this magazine that came in, and the cover was about how to raise funds from religious people. And by religious, they really meant Christian. It was pretty obvious. And they said that the way to raise money was polarize the issue and to push people toward whatever end, and that's how you would motivate them to part with their money. That's true. And like you were talking about marketing feeling sleazy, that felt really sleazy. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's not what we're called to as Christians, is not to go be polarized and angry all the time and all of these things. And it really, I grieved that. Yeah. I do too. It's funny because I think those people would probably say, I'm fundraising for a really good cause. And they're not thinking about the collateral damage of how their fundraising impacts people. And that's really tough as a content creator. I mean, you and I know is whether we like it or not, we're teachers and we're going to have an extra judgment for what we're doing.
That's right.
And that is a scary thought. And it's something that we really should take into consideration when we make episodes and stuff. But I don't think everybody does. We don't think about the messages we're putting out there and the hatred we're causing. And I really do think that one of our greatest inhibitors for sharing the gospel right now is that we're so focused on creating an enemy. What I like to say is those people. If those people didn't exist, then this whole country would be great and the church would be wonderful. And that's not true. The reality is that Jesus died for us and then died for them as well. So I had a guest on a few years ago who said, even if you believe that Muslims are your enemy, Jesus commanded you to love your enemy. So there's no way that you can get out of saying, oh, well, I don't have to pay attention to those people. I don't have to share the gospel. There's no secret door. There's no loophole out of this. You are to love all of the people and you are to share the gospel to all nations, regardless of who you think those people are. In fact, I would say if you have those people in your life, maybe that's who you need to be focusing on. Maybe that's who God has called you to minister to. I don't know. I'll get off that soapbox, but I think that's really valuable in this time when so many of the people, I'm not a great evangelist. I'm actually pretty bad at it, but I try. And when I do end up talking to non-Christians, a lot of the times it ends up coming around to politics and economics and those kinds of things and not having to do with Jesus at all. And my goal is generally to be exception to what they think a Christian is, because they think of Christians as being these bullies and these jerks. And if I can be the exception and be like, no, I'm a human being. I'm a flawed human being, but I'm a human being who has a relationship with the Creator. And that's a pretty cool thing. I think that's way better than me just listing all of their sins. I don't think that's as effective.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever helpful to get into those they conversations. I mean, when we turn somebody into the other or into they, that other group. I've spent time with genocide survivors. I've studied it a bit. Not an expert, but I've been around it in the work that we do, and it always starts with making those divisions and polarizing people and scapegoating. And the name, just the dehumanization in the language that we use when we start calling names when we don't have a real relationship. And we teach, it's not ours, but it's used in reconciliation programs around the world, is this journey of healed trauma, journey of unhealed trauma. The main difference between the two models is the storytelling.
Yeah.
And it just tells you how important that is. Like literally people live and die on our stories that we tell.
Really do.
Yeah.
They really do. And that's a scary thing. I mean, you look at our political situation now, and people believed a story that the election was stolen in the United States, and that was clearly disproven, right. easily disproven. And what it did on January 6th, storming the Capitol, was based on the power of a story. Not backed by facts, but it aligned with what they wanted to believe and created that those people, those Democrats or whatever, are bringing this country down. And the reason don't have the job I want, or I'm not as wealthy as I want to be, or the world doesn't look like it did when my grandparents were alive, is because of those people. And so I'm going to go storm the Capitol. The stories have a real impact, which is, again, it's one of the reasons I think that teachers are going to be judged harsher, because what we do has a huge impact on people. So I think it's vitally important that we as teachers encourage folks to look deep. Like what I like to say is, oftentimes the problem that you're having with somebody is not the real problem. So it's like if you get in an argument with a loved one, we argue with our loved ones the most because we love them and they're close to us. So you may be upset that somebody didn't, do the dishes, but in reality, what's behind that is you're upset that they forgot your birthday, and so maybe your reaction about the dishes is way over the top because it's not really the main issue. There's something behind that. And I think what we as Christian teachers can do is try to encourage people to look for that issue that's behind something rather than seeing the symptoms of that thing. So, if you're, the Bible does call homosexuality a sin, for example. But in the Christian world, that sin, and there's a lot of sins that all of us fall into, that sin has been elevated above all the other ones to be like the mark of the beast. And that, when it's not, and so we should be doing is seeing what's behind that thing, that sin, and trying to minister to people rather than to just be able to write them off as like, oh, I can't talk to you because you have this one sin that I don't struggle with. That,
yeah, gossip is in that same list, I think.
It is
referred to. So.
Yeah, when you look at the words of Jesus, and the Pharisees are all proud of themselves because they haven't committed adultery. And what does Jesus say? Well, if you have lusted after a woman in your heart, then you have committed adultery with her. And honest to goodness, that's going to put all of us into those categories. All of us are adulterers. If you've ever seen somebody who is good looking, probably committed adultery in your heart. And so we forget that levels the playing field. And it's a scary thing to think that I am on the same level as every other sinner. But it's also very freeing as a believer to be like, okay, well, now I no longer have to be all judgy. I can just go out there and be Christ to people. And there's so much freedom. I don't know. I'll get off the soapbox in a second, but I feel like one of the things that should bind us together as Christians is that we have all admitted that we are sinners. But then we pretend like we aren't, or we haven't been sinners. And that's really dangerous. We have to remember that Christ has saved all of us. And but for the grace of God, we would all be lost in our sin. So we have no reason to be as high and mighty as we are. So anyway, end of soapbox.
Well, it's truth, right? And that's what we're responsible to do, is to tell the truth. And people don't always want to hear that, but like you said, as teacher, that's our responsibility. And so thank you for doing that. I want to encourage people, check out Truce, sit down and enjoy a few. It's great for binge listening. You don't have to binge listen. I mean, the episodes are what, 20, 30 minutes? They're
between 20 and 40 minutes generally.
Yeah. Okay. They're not so long and heavy that and they're really interesting, but go in with an open mind and ready to learn something. And context, context is so important, especially in this day and age, and it's hard to find. So thank you for doing that hard work. There's one episode that I recently listened to that I loved, that you were using material from a book that you'd used to research the topic. But rather than just quoting the book or even reading from the book or having somebody voice over what the author had said, you went and found the author and interviewed him. And so we got to hear what he had to say. And just those extra steps mean a lot. I know I'm thankful for that effort. And I hope that does pay off for you sooner rather than later. It's so good quality work like this, good quality storytelling. And I'm talking to all of you content creators out there. Do the good work, and also realize that that is work that you should be getting paid for.
And it's okay to get paid. And it's important because as we were talking in the pre-interview, I recently realized that I'm kind of poor, and it can be a really scary thing. And I think a lot of content creators live in that space. And we all know what it's like to have somebody come up and say, oh, would you do this thing for me for free? And they try to guilt you into it, but you deserve to be paid. And I think there's a lot of backup in scripture for that. The ox should not be muzzled while it reaps,
Yeah, in ministry and nonprofit, we get it's kind of the same type of thing. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so unfortunate because we like to have missionaries look sufficiently happy and also sufficiently poor. And like the worst possible thing we can imagine is a missionary who's well funded, because we love those stories of like, oh, I got down to my last dollar and then God sent a check. Well, I think those stories are actually really sad, because it's like, well, imagine what they could do if they didn't have to go from check to check, It's kind of a dehumanizing thing.
I love the stories where the missionary has what they need to get where they're going and do what God's called them to do. And then we get to see God moving and providing in somebody else's life, and think of the stories we get then.
Right.
So,
yeah, I know they're not as dramatic, but it's what we could do if our missionaries were well funded. I guess we could talk about that forever, but
yeah. Well, for those of you interested in that conversation, the show before this one is my interview with Mary Valloni, who is a fundraising coach for missionaries.
So. Yeah, good plug. Good cross promotion there.
That's right. Chris, thank you so much for being on. All the links are going to be in the show notes. And so you'll be able to find the Truce podcast and connect with Chris on the different social media areas. And do go give that a listen. And let us both know what you think.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, Kay. This has been great.
As always, the show notes are at lifeandmission.com. This is episode 60, so you'll find the notes at lifeandmission.com/60. Hey, if you enjoyed this show, and especially if you check out Chris's podcast, why don't you go on and review both of them? That would really be awesome, and it would help us both out. That's how podcasts grow, is when you share it with your friends and when you write a review. So that's why we talk about those things so much. And that wraps it up until 2 weeks from now, when we'll be back with another episode. This has been the Life and Mission Podcast. I'm Kay Helm. Find your voice. Tell your story. Change the world.